All right, let me begin with an announcement. The history department has recently initiated a minor. You could not have a minor in history until now. So the minor has just been initiated, and for those of you who are not history majors but majors of your some other subject is your major, but you might want to think about a history minor. There is a kind of a information session and reception with refreshments on the 21st, I think it is. No, sorry, excuse me, on the 14th, which is next week. So it's an open house from 1 to 3 p.m. in Bunch Hall in the conference room. That's Bunch 6275. So if you're interested at all in the minor, do go to that open house. Secondly, I had sent you an email. I don't expect that most of you would have seen it because I only sent it about half an hour ago. And it's about Macaulay. You recall that in my previous lecture, I had discussed his minute on Indian education. I had also mentioned to you that Macaulay's name keeps on coming up all the time, even though that minute was written 180 years ago. And so, in fact, just a few days ago, a very lengthy article was published in an Indian magazine called Scroll, an internet online magazine. So I've sent you the link to that. Much of the controversy that still swirls around the minute has to do with the fact that there are people both on the right and left of the political spectrum who think that, in fact, the anglicized elite were in India today and for the last 150 years are precisely the kind of people that Macaulay had wanted to create, all right? A class of interpreters between the rulers and the masses, because, as I've mentioned to you on a number of occasions, notwithstanding the common impression that English is widely spoken in India, that's not the case at all. English is a language that everybody would like to speak. They'd like to get to know that. Even people who are at the lower end of the economic spectrum, people who belong to the working class, people who live in lives of considerable poverty, if at all they have the resources and the money and the opportunity, they'll send their children to English language schools, English medium schools, because English is the language of mobility. It's not the only language of mobility, but it gives you more upward mobility than do the other languages. And of course, you can sell yourself globally, needless to say. You can start working in the U.S. if you get a work permit and all of that if you know English, but if you know only Tamil, it's not going to help for obvious reasons, right? So forth and so on. So that's. But I sent that link to you because the debates that were being carried out in 1835 and in subsequent years sound very, very contemporary, right? I mean, this is not just an arcane body of knowledge that I'm speaking about here. And particularly what I'm going to be speaking about today, you might think to yourself, well, this is all something that, happened in the 1830s, beginning in the 1760s, 1770s, this body of knowledge that began to be created. But, how does one understand its implications today? And in part, that's what I'm going to be speaking about today. So in my previous lecture, I had concluded with a very brief discussion. I'm very hopeful I'll be able to return to that later on, of Warren Hastings' letter to Nathaniel Smith, the director of the East India Company, accompanying the translation of the Bhagavad Gita by Charles Wilkins. So we were saying that the company was actually extending its patronage, and some Indian works began to be translated. But what I want to do today is to give you the larger picture. I had given that to you in a different way before. We have actually looked at this slide, but now we want to come back to this. And the centerpiece of the discussion, in a way, is the article by Bernard Cohn, the readings you have by Bernard Cohn, which have to do with colonialism and its forms of knowledge. Because what is a fundamental hypothesis argument today? It is that every conquest is also a conquest of knowledge. It's, we think of the military conquest, the economic conquest of India, what Britain gained by India, all of that, but the conquest of knowledge is the enduring one. Because when the last of the British left the shores of India, when the last of the colonizers left, they still left behind a certain conception of India. They had left behind a certain body of knowledge which was created according to their templates of thinking about India, right? And much of the understanding that many Indians have of their own history, of their own institutions, is in fact the understanding that was bequeathed by the British. So that's what we're calling the conquest of knowledge. Now, what were the forms that this conquest of knowledge took? Right? We're going to look at that systematically today, but just to give you, just so that you can have a sweeping view. And we're talking only about the first several decades. In fact, this project of creating a body of knowledge about India would accelerate greatly after the 1850s. And why would it accelerate greatly after the 1850s and even after the 1830s? Because, of course, now British rule in India was on a very firm footing, right? I mean, there was no question that the British were the rulers of India. British territories in India were expanding. And as more territories came under their jurisdiction, there were obviously a greater number of areas about which they had to know things. You could know something about Bengal, but it might not help you very much in many respects if the Punjab had now been absorbed into your territories, that is Western India, in the 1840s. Okay? So we're going to find, and that particularly after 1857-58, when the company rule is formally ended, it had ended really effectively some time ago, but formally company rule had ended, and now India became what is called a crown colony. That is, India is going to be ruled directly by the British Parliament, right, in 1858. After that, of course, it became very clear that the last remnants of resistance to colonial rule had ended. Now that resistance is going to resurface much later on. That's the rise of modern nationalism, but that's going to be several decades later. Right? And then we're going to find that in the 1850s, among many other things, 1850s and going on into the next several decades, for example, the British are also going to institute not just education, which they'd already begun to do at the primary level, at the school level, but they're going to create a whole set of universities, for example, right? So they're going to turn their attention to higher education as well. But all of that is much later on. I'm saying that what I'm showing you here, that all of this is going to accelerate. This is just a slice of the total picture of the kinds of works that they were producing. So if you just look at it, you see 1763, Orme, we're going to look at one of his essays. He publishes the first volume of the History of Military Transactions of the British Nation. You get a work, 1766, a narrative of the transactions in Bengal. That is a narrative of British transactions. What are the British doing in Bengal? What was the company doing? What kind of agreements and treaties was it entering into with Indian rulers? What happened at Plassey? All of that, right? James Rennell, 1767, appointed Surveyor General, right? Well, who's the Surveyor General? What is this modality that we call surveying? Right? We'll turn to all of that systematically, but this is giving you a little slice of that picture, as I said, because to survey the land means that you have to then either rely upon some body of knowledge that exists before and then add to it. What would be that body of knowledge if you were surveying the land? Cartography, the creation of maps, right? But then again, there's a very interesting set of questions which I cannot address here. Was there a tradition of map making in India, for example? Did the British supplant indigenous traditions of map making? And some people will say unequivocally there never was any. Well, that's only if you have a indigenous conception of map making. That's only if you're thinking that a map takes a certain form, right? Because we know that the Jainas, for example, the Jains, I've mentioned them before, one of the representatives of one of the major practitioners of one of the major religions to have come out of the soil of India, namely Jainism. Mohandas Gandhi, much later on in the late 19th century, 20th century, is going to be someone who is also in many ways influenced by Jainism. If you look at Jaina maps, which go back centuries before what Reynolds was doing, you find that the entire cosmos is reproduced as a map inside the body of a person. So you see a figure, and then in the chest, the entire chest, you see a map drawn in there. Okay, right? Now that's a different notion of a map. It's a cosmographic map. So there are interesting sets of questions which I cannot obviously tackle here. What is a politics, indigenous politics of map making? What kind of epistemologies did that draw upon? What kind of epistemologies did Western map making draw upon? The latter we will be speaking about a little bit, Western epistemologies, because this is another way of understanding what we're seeking to do today. We're looking at the whole question of epistemology. What is knowledge? What is the nature of knowledge? Who produces knowledge? And under what circumstances? Right? What is the relationship of knowledge to identity? How is it that a certain body of knowledge gives rise to a certain conception of identity? How do you know who you are? Right? What is the nature of your identity, and how has that been created by a body of knowledge? And you might say, well, it's self-evident, right? I'm an American. Well, then we need to understand, what does it mean to speak of what it means to be an American? What body of knowledge actually gave rise to the notion of America? All right? What was the role of cartography? What was the role of history? The role of geography in creating a certain conception of what we call America? Right? And that's only working at the most primitive level, because identity is not simply a matter of your national affiliation or what kind of passport you carry. Right? It has to do with a great many things. And your identity is not stable. You think it is, it's not. It's not even remotely stable, because, as I very often give a very colloquial example, if I was locked up in a room with 10 people, and they all happened to be African Americans, and they were all 6 feet 8 inches because they all were playing in the NBA, right? Well, then I would be thinking, like, hey, man, I'm really short. I'm really, really short. They could dunk me, right? Okay. But if you lock me up in the same room with 10 young women, right, and I happen to know that they were all heterosexual, and let's supposing that I also was not gay, I was straight, I might think to myself, wow, I've got a fertile field here, right? I might be thinking about myself as a male at that point, as a heterosexual male, not as someone who's short. And if you lock me up with 10 men, I'm thinking of all kinds of other things, right? Race might become important to me at that point in time, If I'm traveling in Botswana and someone says, who am I might say I'm an Indian. But if I'm traveling in India and someone says, well, where are you from? I'm not going to say I'm from India. That would be ridiculous, right? I might be expected to say I'm from Punjab or Bengal or so forth and so on. I mean, what identity you assume at a moment, right? And we're not, is going to vary. And we're not even speaking of identities that people assume, such as myself, where I don't even think in these terms, to be quite frank, most of the time. In national terms or in gender terms, I might be thinking, well, this is my politics. I'm an intellectual, or at least I think I am, right? I'm a scholar, and this is my politics, and these are the fundamental questions for me, so forth and so on. So when we talk about the conquest of knowledge, we're talking about a number of things. We're saying, number one, I've mentioned that before, I'm going to reiterate it yet again, because typically one does not study colonialism in this fashion, that one simply looks at, well, what was the nature of the military conquest, the political conquest. And we're talking about the intellectual conquest here, that the British achieved in many ways. Whether this was resisted and to what extent and how successfully is another set of questions. Right? That's number one. Number two, when we're speaking about conquest of knowledge, we're speaking about questions of epistemology. That we fundamentally get to the question of what is knowledge, how do we constitute a field of knowledge, how do we know truth, what is the nature of this enterprise. And then number three, which follows a corollary to two, that we have to be aware of the politics and the political economy of knowledge production. Who creates this body of knowledge? Under what conditions? What politics informs that? And I've hinted at this before in my previous lecture. You know, why is it that the British create this body of knowledge, but we in India did not create a body of knowledge that was of this kind about Britain, or about France, or about the US? Right? Right? And partly, in part, it has to also do with questions of resources, access to universities, so forth and so on. All right? So now the Surveyor General, that's where I was, 1767. Right? What exactly did that really entail? What was his position? We'll understand that. 1769, Robert Orme appointed historiographer. Historiographer, he is the person who, to the East India Company, EIC is East India Company, the company is already in a sense aware of its destiny. It's saying we're going to appoint a person who's going to actually be the official historian of the company. And he's going to work as a historian, right? And Alexander Dow publishes History of Hindustan in 1770. These are largely histories we're talking about. Notice that in these years, we're talking mainly about histories, and we're talking about a second body of knowledge, which is works that are going to be grammars and dictionaries, for the obvious reason that as the British continue to consolidate their rule and larger expanses of Indian territory, right, become absorbed into British India, the number of languages that they are going to encounter, about which they will need to know something, are going to grow. Persian is important at this point in time. It was the official language of administration under the Mughals. And most of the country is still in some sense or the other under Mughal rule, you might say, or at least in North India. Right? But so the grammars are going to, and now 1772, just right after that, George Hadley's grammatical remarks on the practical and vulgar dialect of the Hindustan language commonly called Moors. Moors, you know, they're thinking of India as a land where you have a large number of Muslims. There's no language called Moors, right? There's Hindi, there's Urdu, but this is what they're thinking about, right? And then you see the compilation of the Code of Gentoo Laws, or Ordinances of the Pandits. Remember the project that was going to be initiated by Warren Hastings. We're going to try to find a code of law for the Hindus, which will be applied to them, and we're going to find something similar for the Muslims, right? And then 1778, publication of Nathaniel Halhead, the same person in 1776 who had done the Law of Ordinances. There are three or four major Orientalist scholars at this point in time. So 1778, he does a grammar of the Bengal language, Bengali. And following that, James Rennell, go back to 1767, the same man who was the Surveyor General, he publishes his Bengal Atlas. Right? And, you know, all these slides will be made available to you. And if you look at the next one here, so this is just a continuation of that chronology. William Kirkpatrick, 1785, publishes a vocabulary of Persian, Arabic, and English, right, containing such words as have been adopted from the two former languages and incorporated into the Hindui. Hindui is his understanding of Hindi. At this point, the British were not quite sure what the linguistic situation really was, right? And there again, 1786 and 1790, you see Gilchrist's A Dictionary of English and Hindustani. Right? Hindustani is effectively, for example, my mother tongue. Right? It's that language which is spoken in India and Pakistan, but then you know, they use a different script in Pakistan, and of course in India, when you Sanskritize it, that is, you would put more Sanskrit words into it, then it's going to become partially incomprehensible to the person in Pakistan. And similarly, when they Arabicize it, that Hindustani there in Pakistan, it's going to start to become less comprehensible to a person in India. Yeah? But you also see that the East India Company is, and I have mentioned this, but here you can see the chronology. Look at 1793, East India Company establishes the Hindu College in Banaras. So this is the first institution of higher education of sorts. It's really, an advanced high school, I would say. That's what it is. But that's what it's called, Hindu College. And then if you go further down in 1802, establishment of the College of Fort William at Calcutta, right? And 1804, establishment of the College of the East India Company at Haileybury. Haileybury is not in India. This is back in Britain. And this was the college set up by the East India Company to offer some education to company officials who were going to travel to India for work, right? People who were going to take up positions in India, so they could learn some rudimentary history, maybe acquire some training in Indian languages. As time went on, they would add that, and so forth and so on. You can study these slides at your leisure later on, and then just the last of these, just a continuation of that chronology. 1805 to 17, one single Orientalist, Colebrook, publishes grammars of Marathi, Punjabi, Telugu, and Kannada. Now, I wonder if you knew all four of these languages. Telugu and Kannada are not Indo-Aryan languages. They're Dravidian languages. They belong to a different linguistic group, a very different set of languages, as opposed to Marathi, which is a language derived from Sanskrit. It's an Indo-European language, right? That he may, and this is where it gets complicated. This is where scholars who have worked on Colebrook would have to investigate all the archival sources, then try to understand, was he relying upon Indian translators, interpreters, right? So forth and so on. Their names are not known to us. They're anonymous. And there's a political history there. It's always, the Englishman in the singular who's known. The Indians are always there, hovering in the background, in the masses, unknown, anonymous. Right? Oh, you see how all these political concepts would have to be unraveled to understand how knowledge is produced, because it may well be the case. I'm not a specialist on Colebrook, but I doubt very much that he knew these four languages. And there are others, because he does translations from the Sanskrit, for example. Then we have Francis Buchanan, 1807 to 14, carrying out, now this is the first survey of its kind, and we will turn to what that means to these surveys. Carrying out a statistical survey, right? What is a statistical survey, right? We have to start thinking about the rise of statistics. What my colleague in the history department, who has written a wonderful book, Ted Porter, many years ago, Trust in Numbers. When did we start trusting in numbers? When did numbers become so important? We know someone who is really, really obsessed with numbers, right? The President of the United States, because every tweet is about, a lot more people were at my inauguration, fake news, false news, numbers. He's obsessed, right? When did numbers become so important? What is this? Why do we think that numbers have a validity? Right? When did we begin to trust statistics? Yes?
Oh, is the Statistical Survey a census then of Bengal?
In part.
Okay.
Yeah, it is. It is, but it's not but it's the census usually would not get into such things as flora and fauna and all of that. This is a lot more than that. Census would really be an enumeration of number of people. Yes, you could, depending on which kind of census it is, where it's carried out. In Australia, for example, when they carry out a census, they always include religion. Always. In many countries, they don't, because the argument is that that can actually become a source of division. all right? And in India, there's been a lot of dispute about whether caste should or should not be included. It used to be included in the census until the 1930s, 40s, and then it was completely dropped, but it was resumed again in the last census after many decades. So what categories one uses, that's all going to be part of the discussion that we're going to have. But I think you now get the gist of what I mean. So now you're seeing a certain other forms of knowledge beginning to emerge, the Statistical Survey, and if you look at 1814, Benjamin Hayne tracks historical and statistical, right? So you begin to see the word statistics, which you would not see in books written in the 1750s, 60s, and 1770s. And 1817, opening of the Hindu College, the first English language institution. And you might think, well, what about Banaras College? No, it was not English medium, you see. So this is English medium now. So this is before Macaulay. So you can see the trend is already beginning. And this Hindu College is going to later on become Presidency College. It still exists. It's celebrating its 200th anniversary this year. And a few years ago, they elevated it to, quote, a university, Presidency University. And if you notice down there, John, Malcolm, James, Todd, these names should be familiar to you now, the big four that I had talked about, right? So political history of India, history of the Marathas, and so on. All right. Now let's turn to this a little more systematically. That when we're looking at these forms of knowledge, we can also think of them as modalities of governance, because these forms of knowledge enable British rule as well. Bernard Cohn identifies several of these modalities. It doesn't mean that these are the only modalities, but these are some of the more prominent ones. The historiographic, the observational, survey as opposed to surveillance. Surveillance is when the state has a network of surveillance, right? It's watching you. Right? So if let's say if you took a national security state such as the United States today, part of the surveillance modality would be the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, right? But survey would be things like topography, the U.S. Geological Survey. So that's the difference between survey and surveillance. And surveillance, of course, is going to entail many other things, such as keeping a watch over people who are criminals or who've been convicted. In the United States, the sex offenders registry that most states, probably every state has it, I'm sure, that's part of the surveillance modality, right? It's a way for the state to keep a watch, all right? And it doesn't keep a watch just on those who are criminals. That's the whole idea. That's why ID cards, driver's licenses, driver's license is also an identification card. It's not simply a permit that legally allows you to drive. It's also an identification. And you can be certain that the state knows a lot more about each one of you than you think it does, right? Enumerative modality, that's numbers. When did we enter into the world of numbers, right? And what are the implications of that? I'm going to pursue each of these for 3 or 4 minutes. That's all I'll be able to do. But I'm giving you the sweep here now. Linguistic modality, this impulse to create grammars, dictionaries. One of the most gigantic projects undertaken in India was the Linguistic Survey of India. The entire set is in the library, run by this one man. He's running the show, really. He had spent time in India, but then he moved back to Great Britain, John Grierson, and it's something like, 10,000 pages. Right, massive survey of Indian languages, which languages are spoken where, what is the spread of languages, how do languages spread, so forth and so on. How does one divide them? How does one classify them? Right? When can we say that a language is not a language but a dialect? What's the difference between a language and a dialect? So forth and so on. It's massive. And there's a new linguistic survey now that has been carried out and is still not completed. And something like this in India is a massive project because of the linguistic diversity, of course, right? Museological modality. What is a museological modality? From the word museum, right? But we'll turn to that again. But I'm just I give a very brief description here so that you can start thinking about it. Because what is the museum? It's a bounded form of knowledge, right? I mean, here's a provocation for you. Is it the case that the museum is a particular way of knowing about the world, thinking about the world, and that this is actually a peculiarly Western form of knowledge, right? Now I know, and you all know, that there are different kinds of museums. You know, there's a natural history museum, right? Where natural history museum, you can expect it's going to begin with the dinosaurs, right? There's a natural history museum. Then there's art museums, and of course there are many kinds of art museums. You know, you can divide it into modern art, ancient art, medieval art, whatever the case might be. But then there are museums such as the new Museum of African American History and the African American Experience in Washington, D.C., just opened a few months ago by Barack Obama, right? On this part of the Smithsonian. You know, that whole area is dedicated. It's like Museum Mile, whatever you want to call it. You know, the Smithsonian has 20 museums. But here's a provocation. You know, why a museum to the American Indian? First you commit the genocide, wipe them out, and then say, well, at least we'll give you a museum. Think about it. Right? I mean, we think about what is the politics of a museum. What form of knowledge does it represent? Is it easier to live with another culture by putting it in a museum, but you can't deal with its living specimens? Right? Because if you ask most white Americans or black Americans or Hispanic Americans or people like myself, Asian Americans, how many of us really know an American Indian, a Native American, you know? Well, the answer would be very few of us actually do, you know? But then you can console yourself and say, you know, I'm interested in their history. I understand, you know, I'm a person of liberal disposition. So I'll take that trek to that American Indian Museum. You know, I'll pay my homage there. You know, you see, what I'm saying is we'll have to understand what's the impulse behind museums. Do all cultures relish the idea of a museum? I give this example all the time. And anyone can try to contradict me, but I know from my own experience. You know, if I go to London and I go to the British Museum on a Sunday morning, it's mobbed. You know, I mean, there are like 10,000 people trying to get in. And it's the same thing with MoMA in New York, Museum of Modern Art, or the Met, the Metropolitan Museum. You know, the museums are packed in the West. On a holiday, it's impossible almost. In India, if I go to the National Museum on Janpath in New Delhi, I can just walk in without any problem. No one is there. There are only two categories of people who are ever there. One is school children who have been forcibly brought there by their teacher because they must have some culture. You know, they must have a little bit culture. And I've seen what happens. You know, they go through the whole museum in 10 minutes. It's like check off. You know, when you go to Paris, you've only got 24 hours. So let me go to the, you know, Cathedral of Notre Dame, 10 minutes. Eiffel Tower, 5 minutes. Check off the list. That's what it is. That's one category of people who go to museums in India, is school children. And the second is tourists and non-resident Indians. You know, Indians living here, well, we must show our children our heritage, you know. Right? You'll find them there. If you see an anglicized Indian at the National Museum, you can be absolutely certain that that person is living in the US or UK. All right? No Indian ever goes to museums. They just can't be bothered. Right? Well, then we have to say, well, is that because they're ignorant, they're not interested? Maybe they lack intellectual curiosity, right? That would be the answer here. They lack intellectual curiosity. But then you have to think about what is the nature of a living culture. Maybe the reason you have to all go to museums here is because there's no living culture in some sense, certainly not American Indian, right? It's a bounded space. A museum is a bounded space, right? But that's the museological modality that we're talking about. The whole creation of museums, the institution of museums, because the liberal disposition in this country has been largely shaped by museums. People don't understand that. You know, the number of people who are educated, you know, they believe that they're liberal, ecumenical, they're interested in the world, you know, they'll go. They'll go to LACMA, they'll go to MoMA, they'll go to Met. You know, it's a rite of pilgrimage. You don't go to the traditional pilgrimage site. The museum is almost a pilgrimage spot for a certain kind of liberal person today. So we need to think about all of this. I think you should know that this course is intended to produce some amount of, you know, discomfort about things that you have taken for granted. Because you might say, oh, isn't that a wonderful institution? Well, I think we have to think about what these institutions are. Surveillance modality, I've hinted at it. We'll turn to all of them in detail. Anthropological modality. Now knowing India through categories such as ethnicity. What are the different castes and tribes, you know, of India? What is a history of human evolution? And does this history square up with what we think is a history of evolution? That's what scholars, British scholars, were thinking about, right? When they were thinking about what we might call the anthropological modality, right? So let's turn to each of these. The historiographic modality. You saw through those slides that we're talking about a large number of histories being produced. But before we entertain some more detailed speculations, we need to think about the idea of history. You know, I belong to that minuscule group of people who think that, in fact, although I teach in the history department and I'm a professor of history, that in fact Indians were never really particularly interested in the idea of history at all. That's not because they don't have the intellectual apparatus and the analytical ability, because it is widely conceded. If you're, for example, a scholar of linguistics, the first grammar written in any language which was written in a purely scientific way and is still viewed as a great model by modern day linguists very often is a grammar written in Sanskrit, right? Approximately 3rd century BCE. We know that they're producing works of what you might, I'm going to just use the English word for the sake of convenience, works of theology, and they're creating works of philosophy which go back to remote antiquity. The Upanishads, which were translated for the first time in circa 1790s, 1800, well, the earliest Upanishads go back to 800 BCE, 800 years before the Common Era, right? So it's not that they can't produce analytical works, philosophical works, literary works, but there's no interest in producing works of history. There is no equivalent to Thucydides or Herodotus or the Latin historians such as Livy in India. Okay, and the British viewed this as a deficiency. Because by the 16th, 17th century in England, there was a taste that had developed for history. History became the principal modality, the principal way through which people began to understand who they were, what their past was. Right? And today, the hegemony of history is underscored by the fact that you cannot tell any group of people, the smallest tribe in the world, you know, a group of people, let's say, with only 500 people left alive in that group. You know, there are languages, by the way, that are now spoken by only 100 or 200 people. You know, you can monitor their languages and be different. These are different linguistic ethnic groups. One thing you cannot tell any of these people is they don't have any history. Everybody has a history. And of course, after identity politics became the norm on American campuses, that's the worst possible thing you can tell somebody is you don't have any history. Everybody has a history and wants to be assured and comforted that they have a history. Right? So from the point of view of people like James Mill, there was the first mark of being a nation is having a sense of history, that the people need to have a sense of history. Right? And there's a relationship between history and rationality. And this is the context in which you should view part of this historiographic modality. The other, of course, is, and that's true of all of the modalities, the imperatives of governance. Right? The fact that the British now had a task of presiding over this expanding territory, they had to know these people. So if you encounter a group of people, you want to know what kind of characteristics they have. What kind of past do they have? Right? For example, the British made a distinction following the rebellion of 1857. That distinction would have repercussions for long after it was made and has repercussions today. What was that distinction? They divided all Indians into two groups, martial races and non-martial races. Martial, that is people who have, military valor or who can be warriors, who are born warriors. I don't know what that means, frankly. And of course today you could say it's complete mumbo jumbo because all the bombs are being dropped from 20,000 feet by a pilot. It's not like people are going out and fighting out. Well, yes, I know there is street warfare going on in Syria, I know that, but I'm saying on the whole, if you look at how war is conducted, it's completely anemic. I mean, forget about notions of chivalry and this and that, that's all gone. You just press a button, a drone attack, you're in the Pentagon. That's how drone attacks take place. All right. So, but what we were saying was that at that point in time there was this idea that some people are martial and others are not. And martial people are the ones we can trust, because having a martial spirit also means you, for example, you display qualities of masculinity. Masculinity goes with reason, so forth and so on. All of these characteristics are piled up together, right? So when Orme writes that essay, which you have for your reading, on the effeminacy, that's much earlier. Indians are effeminate. There are no men in India, in short. There are no men. At that point, that was the theory. They're all like women, Orme has this passage. If you read it, if you haven't read it, read it, that essay. It's very short, and it's hilarious, too. But he has this passage where he says an English sailorman, all he has to do is, swirl his stick, right, walking stick, and 50 Indians go flying here and there, They're all effeminate, they're rice eaters, etc., etc. So, but these histories, what is the relationship? These modalities overlap, of course. They're not completely discrete. And the historiographic modality has elements of some of the other modalities, and some of the other modalities obviously also overlap with the historiographic modality. But these histories were, so how do we know who are the martial races or not? We have to know the history of that group. And this historiographic modality produced some of these tropes I have talked about. The idea of Oriental despotism, the idea of effeminacy, Robert Orme. Right? Or what they did was they basically said, we're going to write a history of this group of people known as the Sikhs. Well, this means that we have to have a very clear idea of who the Sikhs are, and that we think that they are a distinct group. But this was always a problem in Indian history, and continues to be, that the Sikhs are sometimes seen as being completely distinct, and sometimes they are seen as a branch of Hindus. Right? Of course, many of the Sikhs will take offense today, but that's because they have now been radicalized into believing that they have their own completely distinct identity. In the Punjab in the 1980s, it was very common. 1980s I'm talking about. I'm not talking about remote past. In the Punjab, in the 1980s, it was very common, before the political turmoil in Punjab began, that in the same household, the first child was raised as a Hindu, the second as a Sikh. Right? But when Cunningham writes the history of the Sikhs, what is he doing? He has said, they have their own distinct history, and I'm going to demarcate it from the history of the Hindus. Right? So these histories created certain categories as well. They're not just giving you a chronological past. They are creating certain kinds of histories. You know, who are the martial races, that idea 1858? Well, they rely in part on a man called James Todd, who writes this voluminous work on the history of the Rajputs and Rajasthan, Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan in 1830s. And he writes about a group of martial people of martial valor known as the Rajputs. All right? That's what the historiographic modality is doing. The observational modality. What is the observational modality? The knowledge that was produced of India was not just produced by people who were historians or people who were charged with governing India. Travelers. The English were traveling to India. Today, there is a travel circuit. If half the foreign tourists, I would say not half, 75 to 90%, when they go to India, there is a travel circuit. There are well-established travel circuits. For example, you do the triangle in the north. You know, does anybody know the triangle in the north? You're going to do it, right? Delhi, Jaipur, Agra. Delhi, Jaipur, Agra. That's a triangle in the north. Why Agra? Taj Mahal, right? Can't go to India and not have seen the Taj Mahal. Even Barack Obama seen it twice. I mean, he made sure he saw it, right? Jaipur, the pink city, you know, Rajputs. That's the Rajputs, right? That's the triangle. When did the triangle get established? Not post-independent India, much earlier. But then we have to say, what is, okay, so what? People travel, yeah, but number one, you have very few Indians traveling to Britain, of course, very few. In the second half of the 19th century, the numbers would slowly increase because they started going there as students. They're not coming to the US at that point in time, of course. That's much later. Right? But it's not simply a matter of saying, the travel is one way. No, we have to get to the politics of what we mean by the observational travel modality. First is the idea of experience. You know, I've been there, so therefore I can speak with some authority. It gives you a voice of authenticity to say, I've been there. I'm not saying, by the way, that I think that's the case. I'm saying that that's the general idea, right? I've been there. Now, if somebody started speaking to me about India, and I thought to myself, they're speaking with a lot of authority, and then that person might say, you know, just want to let you know, I spent 2 months in India. You know, I traveled there. I know the country. James Mill, who writes a 6-volume history of British India, voluminous, became highly influential, was an armchair traveler. Well, he wasn't even an armchair traveler because there were no travel books really at that time. He never left England to go to India, never went to India. A lot of people criticize his history just for that. I don't. There are many other grounds on which I criticize it, but not that one. Because you can have gone and still have produced a very bad history. In fact, it might be worse, because then you think, you know, I have the authority of my experience. I spent 2 weeks there. But the thing is the observational modality. This is, these people are able to go in ways that sometimes officials were not able to go. They can sometimes penetrate into the territory in ways that officialdom could not. One of the things that you find is that every traveler, almost without fail, would write, and we're going to consider this phenomenon later on. I've mentioned it before. Now there's a different context in which I'm mentioning it. Sati. Right? The phenomenon of widow immolation, self-immolation. When a woman lost her husband, she would go into the funeral pyre of her husband. Now, the British thought this was grotesque, but there was a morbid fascination with it. You know, you could use theories of voyeurism, for example, if you want to, but there is a morbid fascination we'll have to try to understand. When we turn to sati, which we will in great detail, when we look at gender, then we'll talk about it. But it became almost obligatory that you had to write about sati. You had to go witness one. And if you hadn't, you probably had to make up one. You know, right? It's like if you were traveling to China, what would you have to mention? The Great Wall. The Great Wall. That's always a question. Why did Marco Polo, you know, not mention the Great Wall? You know, maybe he never went to China, because he talks about China, he doesn't talk about the Great Wall, right? You had to. And then there are these established circuits, which I've mentioned about. One is going to be the mutiny tour after 1857-58. So all the places where the rebellion had broken out, where British women's, you know, had displayed valor, or where they were ravaged by the lascivious Indian male, you know, right? You had to go to all of these places. You know, if you were British, it was called the mutiny tour. But let me complicate it with one more observation. Each of these, a book, right? You could, whole course, if you start looking at travel narratives. So we're doing it 3 minutes, basically. But here's the thing. This is what I want you to think about. One of the reasons why the British traveled was to India, and this is very important in understanding their travel narratives, is that many of them were nostalgic about a Britain that had disappeared, and that was disappearing, the few remnants of it that were disappearing before their eyes. I'm talking about the early 1800s, 1810s, 20s, 30s. What had happened in Britain that had completely transformed the landscape by 1800, 1850? The Industrial Revolution. It had completely transformed the landscape of England. You will not read a book written in 1700 about London, which is going to talk about how all of the buildings were covered with soot, right, from the chimney smokes. By 1770s, 80s, 90s, it gets worse. You know, there was sometimes a fog. I'm not talking about the famous London fog, okay? You know, quote, produced by natural. I'm talking about the fog of smoke, as you find in India today. You know, now there were Englishmen who were getting nostalgic. You know, what does a rural landscape really look like? In 1820, most Englishmen, particularly if you're nostalgic, had a kind of a romantic disposition about your own country, the only way you could actually encounter that was you went to India. You went to India. And you continued to go there, because if you wanted to understand what England was like in 1700, you look at what India is like in 1850. I would say, by the way, that's still one reason why there's tourism from here and Europe to places like Africa and India. You know, well, see a slice of the past which I really cannot see in my own country anymore, in a way. All right? This is a displacement. This is a displacement. Right? So this is one of the reasons why they were traveling. I'm not saying it's the only reason, but it was one of the reasons. And this is when you start to say, well, we have to be aware of the politics, okay, of knowledge. You know, what is a work really about? You know, is this work really about India in 1850, right? Or is it really something about myself and what I would like to imagine was true for my country? You know, did you have a question?
Yeah. Well, are you saying that with like the travel circuits, the British are telling the Indians what's important and significant about their own history?
Oh, that's true as well.
Okay.
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
that's true as well. Absolutely. Yeah, but it was also that, but this travel was never, you know, we think of it as highly adventurous. And now we know there's no adventurous travel, almost none. I mean, all these so-called adventure tours that are advertised, they're all packaged now. And of course, tourism is mass tourism now. There were no the tourist is a modern invention. There were no tourists in 1600 or 1700. They were travelers. And now I'm saying that even the traveler has become a tourist. Now you need a hyper kind of traveler to really, unless you're going somewhere in, the Amazon where no one has gone to that little stretch before, it's all packaged basically now, even the great treks to the Himalayan mountains, they're all packaged basically. The number of people who go to Mount Everest, I mean, they have a pollution problem. I'm not kidding you. I mean, the amount of garbage they have to pick up from the base camp at Mount Everest, it's huge. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry is going to Mount Everest, and everyone creating records. Someone who's deaf and blind and dumb and this and that. They've gone to Everest. Right? You're an amputee. Right? I mean, there's a record for everything. The oldest person, the youngest person. A woman in 30th week of her pregnancy, world record. Right? This is this phenomenon. You want to create a world record, so you do that. This is all in a way prefigured. I'm just saying this is the development of the idea of the tourist circuit, the traveler. But I'm saying there's a politics. So you have identified one, which is. It's like the history. The Indians don't know their own history. We're going to tell them. They're not good at preserving their own monuments. We're going to preserve them for them. We're going to tell them what's more important. Right? And of course, I know that every one of you could say to yourself, "This guy is really, namely referring to me, is really crazy because the Taj Mahal. Why wouldn't you want to preserve it?" I'm not saying I wouldn't want to preserve it, but there are very serious questions that arise with in India with architectural sites which are now under the care of the Archaeological Survey. Because you have a site, and I'll give you an illustration, very simple illustration. Right? You have a building which is partly in ruins going back to 1300 in Delhi. Now, given the number of homeless, quote, homeless people in India, homeless is a certain category, all right? But people who don't have a shelter over their head, what do? Well, they'll go and sleep there. Now, all the history buffs, the liberals, they go up in arms. This is a part of our history. It's being ruined because if you've got 50 people and there are no toilets, right? And building is very fragile. I mean, the roof could fall, the wall could fall. 1300. I understand. I'm a historian. I understand, the importance of that. But what do you do about those 50 people who are saying, well, at least we have some roof over our head in the bitter cold? These are complicated matters, actually, I think, So you see, what I'm saying is that when we think about all of these things, we cannot work simply with a kind of a received idea of what is heritage. If you put every building in India that was old, over 100 years old, under the care of the Archaeological Survey, there'd be 1 million. Okay? Under the care of the Archaeological Survey, and then what's the point of just having the plaque there if there are no resources? Nothing that are going to be devoted to it. Right? So this is all part of the set of questions that you'd have to think about today. Yeah. Okay, so you had a question.
No, I was just reminding me of, wasn't there like a Egyptian temple on the Nile?
Yeah.
And they wanted
the dam.
Right.
Yeah. So I won't get into that because there's a whole. I mean, I know the history of that. You have to. You try to remove it piece by piece, put it somewhere else. It'll take too long to get into it. But yeah, similar kind of question. Yeah. Okay. Survey modality. The British introduced what was called the trigonometrical survey, a method of triangulation that was used to try to survey the land. What forms of knowledge what particular forms of knowledge are associated with it? Cartography, maps, right? Maps. And what is the point of a survey of this kind? Well, there can be many. Well, you need to know the land. What part of the terrain is accessible and what part isn't. All right? But let me complicate it. Let me give you a simple illustration. In Pakistan today, there is an area called FATA. Right? I'm sure that all of you, I mean, even if you don't follow the news as such, but vaguely you are all familiar with the fact that that Pakistan has often been mentioned, is usually mentioned in the American press as a source of terrorism. You know, okay, there you've got jihadi groups, militant groups, all of that. One of the areas where these groups are found in large numbers is an area of Pakistan called FATA. That's the acronym. Federally Administered Tribal Area. Okay? Federally Administered Tribal Area. It's basically a no-go zone for the government, if I may put it this way. It's very mountainous, rugged. It's not really being charted out. It's very easy for people to slip into that. You know, you commit a terrorist attack in one of the big cities, Karachi, Lahore, Islamabad, whatever the case may be, the area you might want to flee into is FATA. It is what the anthropologist James Scott, in a book called Seeing Like a State, Seeing Like a State, he made a distinction between state spaces and non-state spaces. Okay? State spaces and non-state spaces. Non-state spaces would include places such as FATA, right? Because these are spaces where the government of whichever country, wherever we might find such a distinction, has not been able to make inroads. Their writ does not run there. That would be the easiest way to put it. Their authority doesn't have much sway over there. Now, these surveys have to be seen in that context too. You want to make, the more you survey the land, the more you bring it under the purview of the state. You can manage it, you know. But of course, it was also used, these surveys would also be used for such things as revenue collection. There is an instrumentality there. If you're going to collect revenue from a people, you have to do surveys. The trigonometrical survey was a massive thing, but then there are these regional surveys, revenue surveys. And the whole idea of these was to actually be able to collect information about a land, about property rights. Right? So this is what we're talking about, very briefly. And then, of course, there's a botanical survey. You know, the flora and the fauna of each region is going to be recorded. Now we know, of course, I mean, back in the mid-19th century, very few people were talking about ecological diversity, even though they may have recognized it. But that's one thing that the botanical survey may help you to do. And I want to be very clear, so that you understand, and don't mistake me for as saying something which I'm not. I am not saying that all of these are simply instrumentalities of governance. That is, that all that the British were thinking of doing was divide and rule, or all they were thinking of doing was, well, how do we rule the place more efficiently? How do we rule it so that we can enhance our own power or our own wealth, which includes things such as mineral wealth, right? But it's not just for that. They're doing it partly out of that Enlightenment thing, that we have to know everything that we possibly can, you know, right? And some of this information may be, quote, useful to them in certain ways, right? And some may not be. But then there are other modalities which are clearly, largely instrumentalities of governance, if not entirely, such as the surveillance modality. But this would be less true of the survey modality. The geological survey. Now, if you're going to have improvement, it also means material improvement. We haven't spoken about that yet, have we? Right? That you're going to have to do what any state does, which is what? Build roads, build bridges. Well, if you're going to build a bridge, you have to know what's the soil. You want to make sure your bridge doesn't collapse. That's what the geological survey. It's not only telling you what the mineral wealth of the country is, right? But it has a relationship to engineering projects. These are all illustrations. Remember, I'm not giving you a quite obvious, a comprehensive account of each of these modalities. Right? Enumerative modality. This I've already hinted at. Enumerative modality is the modality, a form of knowledge, right? There were different forms of knowledge within the enumerative modality. The statistical survey would be a very good illustration. The census would be a very good illustration of this enumerative modality. Right? And I'm saying that there was a kind of a trust in numbers, to use a phrase of Ted Porter, the rise of statistics. Right? And India was going to be a very important site for the British. They're going to collect a massive array of statistics about just about everything. However, what this did was it fundamentally transformed, in many ways, the kind of world in which Indians lived. Now that happened here too, except that here perhaps the distinction was never as sharp as it was in India between the pre-modern kind of world where these numbers were imagined in a very different way and what numbers meant over here. What do I mean by this? What I mean by this, and this is where you have to look at what I'm calling the distinction between bounded and fuzzy. That, you see, when you live in a bounded world, it's a world of numbers. Things are sharply demarcated. So I'm counted. Now what happens when I'm counted? Then I'm going to be put in certain categories. For example, sex, male. Right? That's what it means when you start counting. You put people in categories. Now what do you do, for example, with a group of people in India known as the Hijras? The word is translated, I've got a long article on that explaining some of the complications of translating as eunuchs. The third sex. Everybody's talking nowadays about transgender and this and that. There's been a group of people in India for a long time known as the Hijras. So if the census enumerator, when you have a census, you have people called census enumerators. The census enumerator comes knocking on your door. The last time I saw that was in India. When I had gone back to India and they were doing the new census, they knocked on the door. And they have this big sheet. And then they ask you, sit down with you, how many members of the family, what's the level of education, how many males, how many females. So what if they were Hijras? So what are they going to say, male or female? Or are they going to say neither or both or neither and both? Right? Right? What are you see, what is the census doing? What it's doing is it's putting you in a category. The census will then say religion. Check one of the following: Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Sikh, Buddhist, Jain, Jew. Right? What if you thought to yourself you were at least two? In Japan, the anthropologists who have worked in Japan have found, now when you add it all up, it should be 100%, right? So this is technically how it should work, that 70% of the people say they are Hindus, okay? 70% say, we're just taking, by the way, that's about 73% Hindus, and let's say 15% say Muslim, 3% say Sikh, okay, and 1% say Buddhist, and 3% say Christian, and so on and so forth, and then it should be 100%. That accounts for everybody. Okay? Now in Japan, 90% of the people say they're Buddhist, and another 70% say they're Shinto. 90 and 70, if I know mathematics, is 160. Because they're thinking of themselves as being both. Right? But the census does not permit you, now, of course, people are becoming a little more sensitive to these things. It doesn't permit you the luxury of saying, mark all of them, or two of them. Right? This is a bounded world. A fuzzy world is where things are fuzzy, where you have multiple identities, you work with multiple identities, and usually you don't have a problem with it. usually you don't have a problem with it. And one of the ways in which we have to understand, although no one really does it that way, the whole modern impulse in countries such as the US today to think about diversity and all of that is we're actually in some ways going back to how we used to think. People were comfortable with multiple identities. This is a characteristic feature of modernity, that we all became subject to singular identities. We all had to check ourselves off as male or female, or had to check ourselves off as Christian, or whatever the case might be. Right? Because there are people who they found the census enumerators in 1900, when they were putting together the census, they found that people were calling themselves both Hindus and Muslims sometimes. And they said, no, you can't be. You know, I've put it to you, I think maybe I might have mentioned it, if not I'll mention it now, but the British had a formula, if I may put it this way. They said, no, Hindus and Muslims, those are the two most different religions of the world. I mean, you can't think of two religions that are more distinct, right? And as I put it very often, their formula was, take the cow. The Hindu loves to worship the cow. Now, the cow is sacred to Hindus. The Muslim, he loves to eat the cow. He loves to eat the cow. How can somebody be both Hindu and Muslim? You know? Well, but there were people. There were people, and there still are people who say we're both. Right?
Is it possible that the census enumerator, like if they didn't like the answer that they were receiving, they kind of manipulated it?
You have to speak up. Is it possible that the census?
Enumerator, if they didn't like the answer that they received from
Yeah.
the Indian person, that they manipulated?
Oh, of course, it's possible. I mean, you know, there's that, you know, if the because these census enumerators working on behalf of the colonial government were determined to prove that Hindus are Hindus, Muslims are Muslims. Now, if a census enumerator, you know, they ran across a group of people. I'll give you the name. Check it out. I've written about it. Okay, a group of people. For those of you who know a little bit about Islam, just even a tad bit, you'll immediately recognize Hussein. You know who Hussein is? Anyone? Huh? A major figure in Shia Islam. Okay? Husseini, the British encountered a group of people who called themselves Husseini, guess what? Brahmins. I mean, you know, they were just like, the guy must have had a heart attack when he, Husseini Brahmins? What's this hybrid monster or creature? I mean, if you're a Husseini, you're a Shia Muslim, and then you're a Brahmin, because the Brahmins are orthodox, they can't mix with anybody. These people call themselves Husseini Brahmins. You look at the Imperial Gazetteer series for the volumes on the Bombay Presidency, go to the portion on the Gujarat state, and that's where you'll find Husseini Brahmins. You know, right? So you see, how the world used to be much more fuzzy than when numbers, statistics, categorization. I want to have a creation of categories, classification systems. Again, they were instrumental purposes too, right? But we are interested in the implications and the politics of thinking along these lines. Okay, linguistic modality. I'll finish with this very quickly. We've still got more territory here, surveillance and so on, but you know, I'll carry on with this. We're about 20 minutes behind, so pretty much on schedule. Okay, linguistic modality. The creation of grammars and dictionaries. I've already spoken about that. I mean, and I've spoken about it in previous lectures. I'd given you illustration, phrase books, you know, the need to know these languages. The command of language. Why was the command over language important? You know, and as Bernard Cohen wrote in a beautiful piece, the command of language and the language of command. You know, that how is it that then English became the language of command, right? But command is not just rule. It's like when you command somebody, orders, giving orders. That example I'd given you from Gilchrist, right? Classification of languages. Now there can be implications for what happens when a language is classified in a certain way. What happens if some spoken tongue is classified as a dialect as opposed to a language? I'll give you one simple illustration. The government puts in a lot more money into languages than it does into dialects. That's always the case. Languages, and what's the difference? Well, this is something that linguists, very often talk about at great length, but there was a masterful definition given about 80, 100 years ago. I don't think it's ever been bettered. This person said the difference between a language and a dialect is very simply that a language is a dialect backed up by an army and a navy. That's a difference between a language and a dialect, according to this view. Because, dialect is, pupa, right? Language. A language, literary works, money is invested into it, so forth and so on. And then, of course, the Linguistic Survey of India, which was this massive compendium. Part of the linguistic modality was what I have described before as the composition of the critical edition of the text. Remember that when you have 50 different versions of a text, the British had this view, there's one authentic version. One authentic version. Right? But I'm saying that in turn was based on certain assumptions which are quite erroneous about how is it that knowledge is transmitted within a certain culture. If there are 50 different versions of that text, well, each of them is authentic in its own way, because whoever has produced it, we'd have to understand what the production of that work meant for them. Right? All right, we'll stop here, and you will receive your midterm after class on next Tuesday. All right?